So the next thing that we're going to be talking about tonight is silviculture, which all landowners should know about because really informs how you manage your property. Alyssa Gregory, who is one of our district foresters, is going to be doing that. And she is the Mid-Coast District Forester. She obtained a forestry degree from Southern Illinois University, Carbondale. Her professional background includes rural forestry, urban forestry, horticulture, and structure firefighting. Alyssa has most recently worked for the state of South Dakota as a service forester. She's been an active member of SAF, serving as the DSAF's chapter treasurer for 2 years. Alyssa is involved with the tree farm program as a certified inspector and is a project learning tree facilitator. And she's been with the Maine Forest Service for just about a year. She had the misfortune of coming on during COVID. So I think she probably didn't really meet everybody until last week. But welcome, Alyssa. Go ahead and share your screen and give us all kinds of information. And if you have any questions, just go ahead and post them in the chat box and we'll get to them at the end.
Thanks, Terry. I'm going to see if I can get this PowerPoint up here. So as Terry said, tonight we're going to talk a little bit about silviculture. This was one of those classes in forestry school that we all kind of were warned about, that this was a toughie, but it ended up being one of my favorite classes. And it's really cool because it kind of encompasses everything that you learned in forestry school. It doesn't look just at timber management. It looks at soils and hydrology and wildlife and how you can manage all those things together. So before we get started today, I just wanted to ensure that everybody kind of understands that today's lessons, we're kind of looking at textbook cases of silviculture, and that this doesn't take the place of having a plan or a harvest prescription written up. So if you are interested in having a harvest done on your property, I would still encourage you to reach out to a consulting forester. I know it's been mentioned a couple times, but the state does have incentives to have woodland resource action plans written up that can include schedules for your harvest and things too. Sorry, 1 second here. There we go. So one of the things that we do when we have walk-in talks, as what we call it when we visit with landowners, which some of you have already reached out and scheduled walk-in talks, which is really exciting. Thank you guys for doing that, and I look forward to visiting your properties. But some of the resources that we discussed during these walk-in talks, one of them is What Will My Woods Look Like? It's the publication on the top right-hand side of the screen there. And then Woodland Owner's Guide to Forestry for Maine Birds. I know Joe had touched on that in his presentation. And then Which Tree Do I Cut? And if we have time after this presentation, we can take a look at that, that document together. But that's one that I like to hand out to people as kind of a reference that goes over basic silviculture. But these are just a couple of the handouts here that I'm going to mention during my presentation. So what is silviculture? It's holistic. It encourages multiple use. And it's an art and a science. It's holistic because, like I said, it kind of encompasses everything that we have to do with forest management. Before we implement any silviculture practices, we take a look at aspect, soils, what the water requirements are site indexed, and what productivity is going to be. And then we also like to encourage multiple use. There's, multiple forestry objectives, and everyone's is going to be different. And same goes with the forest itself. We can absolutely have timber harvesting and recreation. A lot of times we have to kind of stagger those events. And wildlife usually fits hand in hand really well with silviculture activities. So this is kind of our textbook example definition here of what silviculture is. It's an art and science of controlling the establishment, growth, composition, and quality of forest vegetation for the full range of forest resource objectives. And on that Which Tree Do I Cut document, it also talks about some specific examples. So cutting your own firewood, that can be an example of silviculture. It's a desired outcome. So it can also include wildlife habitat, encouraging certain plant communities. I've had landowners reach out who are interested in threatened, endangered, or just a really specific plant that they want to encourage, like lady slippers, trillium, things like that. So it doesn't always have to just be focused on timber. And before we get too deep in here, I just wanted to go over a little bit of terminology So a stand, when we talk about a stand in forestry, is a unit that can be managed as a whole. It's really going to depend on your management objectives on what a stand's going to be, but it should be large enough to map and small enough to sufficiently be uniform and treated as one unit. We'll also talk a little bit and reference forest succession. So that's the natural replacement of one plant community by another over time in the absence of a major disturbance. And then silviculture systems. So this is going to be our long-term planned sequences of harvesting and practices that are done at different times in a forest development. And this is all done to meet landowners' objectives. And then the silviculture treatments are the single harvesting operations that are going to be part of that silviculture system. So the silviculture treatments are the individual acts that are done in part of the system. So silviculture and your forest goals. So like we talked about in the beginning, everyone's forest is different, everyone's goals are going to be different. So these are a couple different goals that could be your objectives for your forest. You could see one on here that you aren't going to include. You can see here that it's not just for timber production. We include balancing our biology and ecology and economic concerns for renewability of the resource. One of the things with silviculture is balancing how we want to treat our forest, but also making it economically sustainable. If you can't afford to do the treatment, it's not going to get done. So we do have to perform some kind of a balancing act usually. And normally when we're managing for silviculture, we're managing for regeneration unless we're doing intermediate treatments, which we're going to talk a little bit more here in a minute. And if I'm going too fast, please let me know. So we looked at some of the potential goals. Here are some of the issues that we can address with silviculture. And this is also not a definitive list, but one of the most common here in Maine is too many trees. So we're removing that competition. So on the left-hand side here, we have the issues. Right-hand side, we have our solutions. Not enough trees, that's usually not an issue here in Maine. We're pretty fortunate here to have sufficient regeneration. But a lot of times when there's not enough trees, or if it's a change of land use, you can do some reforestation, afforestation, or supplemental planting. And then wrong type vegetation. This can include removal of invasives, but it can also be changing the conditions to favor other species. So one example, there was recently a harvest tour down in Dodge Point that I was a part of, and they were removing the non-native red pine from that area and encouraging the native white pine and red oak species down there. So kind of changing those conditions by removing the red pine and allocating more resources for our native species. And then also balancing access and ecosystem health. Access is really important to your forest. If you're going to spend time out there or have any kind of treatments, you're going to need access. And then I have uniformity over here. A lot of times, and this is usually more of an issue for foresters, uniformity is usually only encouraged in like pine plantations, like southern yellow pine. Up here in Maine, we want to have emphasis on diversity and multiple use objectives rather than that uniformity kind of park-like look. I tend to tell people we're managing forests, not city parks usually. Past land use is something I just wanted to touch on real quick. I know we've discussed this at length in other presentations too, but it's really important when you are doing any kind of silviculture practice to take a look at past land use. It can play a huge role in current and future site conditions. It can affect hydrology, wildlife use, soils. There's also things with past land use that can increase or decrease your productivity. So an example of increasing, and this was a little bit more common from where I came from in Illinois, was there would be residual fertilizer or legume crops that fix nitrogen. So sometimes you would have an increase in productivity the first few years from those residual fertilizers and nitrogen. But then things that can decrease your productivity like soil degradation, compaction, and then erosion. So if you notice those things when you're managing your forest or your consulting forester notices them, there are some resources available, like talking to NRCS. They have some programs that can help you and some techs that can come out and take a look and help you figure out how to address those issues. This is an example that I'm throwing out here that's actually from Illinois, but this is an example of past land use. that the current forest system requires human intervention because of the past land use. So we have these oak savannas that were created by firewood cutting over several decades, which created this variety of diameter classes. If you're familiar with coppicing, it's used pretty frequently for firewood because it's cutting down your tree at the base, at the trunk, getting it pretty well flush, and then encouraging those stump sprouts. And it creates multiple stems that are a much more manageable size for firewood, easier to carry, store, things like that. So over decades where people were cutting these woodlots for firewood, we got this variety of diameter classes. And then in conjunction with that, we also had human created, escaped, and controlled fires. I'm drawing a blank now on which tribe was in that area of Kankakee that did a lot of the savanna controlled burns. But now the Nature Conservancy is replicating those conditions with prescribed fire so they can maintain those black oak grass covers. And this allows for that wildlife that's become dependent over the decades on those ecosystems to continue utilizing them. All right, so let's jump into our silviculture systems here. And we are going to refresh just a little bit on even-aged and uneven-aged stand. I know we've touched on that in other presentations, but just as a refresher here on the next slide, I think we're going to jump into that. But systems are named by the number of age classes of trees that will result. So the number of age classes is really meaningful because it's going to tell us about the stand structure. And I know during Joe Roy's presentation, he talked about the different strata levels in our forest and how we have different wildlife species that'll utilize one strata level over another. So having that understory, midstory, and a developed overstory. With the even age system, you only have one or two age classes. So a lot of times it's an overstory with maybe some regen present. And then our uneven age systems are going to be 3 or more age classes. So even age versus uneven aged. Even age stands are roughly the same age and diameter class. They usually occur when there's a major disturbance or a change in land use. So they're all growing up roughly at about the same time, getting roughly about the same amount of resources once they're able to outcompete. And then our uneven age stands are 3 or more age and diameter classes. They usually occur when there's a low intensity disturbance that takes place and usually includes shade tolerant and intolerant species. And this results in more forest layers and strata. And it's important to note that when you're looking at your own forest, you probably won't see just strictly even aged or strictly uneven age. It's usually a combination of both. And a lot of times, especially on smaller properties, we see patches. And we'll talk a little bit about that here later. So the silviculture treatments, and those are talking about individual treatments that we're doing in our structures. The treatments are defined by their purpose and the time of their application. So it's usually a silviculture treatment is planned with either one or both of the following objectives. So you're wanting to improve the composition of your forest and increase that growth of your remaining trees, and that's going to be an intermediate treatment. Or you're wanting to facilitate the production of new trees within or in place of your forest. So that's regeneration. So in A, we're treating current trees, and B, we are encouraging our next cohort or next generation of trees. And I have this picture here on the right-hand side. This is from that Woodland Owner's Guide for Forestry for Maine Birds. They talk about some silviculture treatments and how they can encourage specific species. Really encourage you guys to check that out. It's a great publication. Okay, so for our even age regeneration treatments, we have clear cut that we're going to discuss, seed tree, and then shelter woods with group shelter woods. I had a silviculture professor and he always said that seed tree and shelter wood was just clear cuts with extra steps. And you guys will kind of see why. Normally with any of these practices, any of these treatments, the intent is always to remove all of the overstory just with a different amount of entries. So with clear cuts, it's the removal of the entire stand in one cutting. This is usually when you're looking at our reproduction or regeneration, it's obtained artificially or from seeds germinating from our seed bank. When you're looking at like southern yellow pine that we have down in the southeast, when they do clear cuts there, they usually take an artificial seed source and they plant usually in rows. And it's actually really fascinating if you ever get the chance. It's a company called Arborgen, and they genetically grow enhanced seeds to get the best timber products. So this is effective in regenerating our shade intolerant trees. So our trees that don't do well growing up under the shade of other trees. So like our aspen, birch, put pin cherry on there too. And then I wanted to point out real quick, if you guys are interested in having a timber harvest on your property, I would really encourage you to pick up one of our rules and regulation books. In that it kind of goes over some of the Forest Practice Act regulations. So we look at size, distribution, and planting of clear cuts. And those are things that are actually regulated. I know Malcolm kind of mentioned that they'll go out and their boots on the ground. I get calls from the rangers all the time to take a look at timber cutting violations, not always clear cuts in my district, but other things. So why do we clear cut? I know this one's usually the less aesthetically appealing option, but we do it to remove a lot of poor quality, intolerant, understocked, short-lived, or really over-mature overstory trees. It can also be to take out ecologically, I guess, improve ecosystems in our wildlife habitats. So there can be, I guess, a multitude of reasons for wildlife habitat, but what comes to mind is like woodcock and grouse, that they really like dense hardwood regeneration patches, and they need to have significant acreage to fulfill their life cycle needs. I think it has to be like a minimum of 1/3 of an acre, but they like up to 4 acres. So just fulfilling some wildlife requirements. I have a couple other things listed there too, but that bottom one, harvesting an existing plantation, that kind of goes back to our southern yellow pine, which, you know, the intent of planting is to clear cut, and then they'll come back through and plant again. We don't really have a lot of those ecosystems here in Maine. You can kind of tell where there have been some kind of trial and error with red pine and with large planting in these kind of plantation styles. But not any that I've seen that have been completely clear cut. So seed tree, this is another one of our even-aged management treatments. As we kind of discussed, seed tree is clear cut with an extra step here. So we are retaining enough mature trees from our treatment to seed in, so we don't have to worry about artificially planting anything. So we want these seedlings to establish in the open from our larger trees, but this doesn't really work for our shallow rooted or shade tolerant species. So spruce and fir don't really do well with the seed tree cuts. Here's an example here. This is one that Terry had shared with me, hardwood seed tree. And you can see here that they've left enough mature trees to seed out. So that'll be our next cohort, our next generation there. But not really enough trees to provide stabilization for our next generation. So this is pretty much solely just being a seed stock. And then here's another example here for our softwood trees. You can see they're pretty well evenly distributed. It doesn't always look this way. There can be kind of clumps here and there, but this one looks pretty evenly distributed. Okay, so our next even age treatment we're going to discuss is shelterwood. So similar to seed tree, but we're leaving enough of our overstory to help establish the trees that are going to be growing up underneath them. So we want our seedlings to become established under those existing trees, and then those canopy, our remnant trees, are going to be removed in 1 to 3 cuts, and usually 5 to 10 year intervals. So this worked really well for species that are shade tolerant, so our spruce and fir trees, and then also it works fairly well for white pine. Maintaining shade with our white pine trees is pretty important, at least until they're about 20 feet tall, to minimize loss to white pine weevil attacks. So I threw in a slide here just for people who aren't aware of white pine weevil. I'm sure you've seen it when you're driving around and you see kind of the candelabra shaped pasture pines. That's usually the white pine weevil. And what they do is they'll kill the top of a conifer, and it usually locates those trees by seeing the top of its silhouette. So by maintaining that cover, we're kind of hiding that silhouette and, you know, keeping them about until they're about 20 feet tall, our regeneration. One of the first symptoms that you'll see is like the attack in the springtime. There'll be a presence of pitch flow from the feeding punctures. And then beginning in late June, you'll start to see new growth on the infested shoots start to droop. So they'll turn kind of that brown color, get almost like a shepherd's hook. And then the tops will die and turn brown. And that can actually happen multiple times to the new terminal lead that's shot up. Okay, so back to shelter wood here real quick. Here is an example of a historic shelter wood. And this is in that What Will My Woods Look Like book. So this kind of steps through our shelter wood step by step here. So we have that first entry, the natural stand there. And then we have our removal first entry there. And then this third picture is when they came back through and removed the remnant tree. So this is our new regeneration, new cohort. And then the last picture here is pretty well present day, where you can see the stand development. So shelter wood can also be done in groups as well. Coming from South Dakota, we did a lot of group shelter wood cuts with white spruce, Black Hill spruce. They're very susceptible to wind throw, so keeping groups, clumps together tends to work better. But you can see in the first picture there, we have the original stand, then our initial cut where they took 20 to 40%. And you can see they've left little patches here of trees. And then we have our second cut. You can see they've removed some of those larger overstory, and we see our regeneration coming through. And then that 5 to 10 year cut, we come back and do another entry and remove the entire overstory. So it's just the newer cohort. Okay, so we went over our even age regeneration treatments. So we're going to take a look now at our uneven age treatments. This is going to include single or small group selection and then our small patch selection cuts. I just wanted to take a second here real quick to, I guess, talk a little bit about selection cutting. When it comes time to harvest on your own property, I cannot emphasize enough to have a contract and to work with a consulting forester and not have the contract say that it's a selective cut. Selective cut is different from a single or small group selection cut. Selective cut is basically logger's choice, and you are giving them freedom to take what they want. Being very specific in your contracts avoids any kind of miscommunication and just makes it easier on everybody. So with that, let's talk a little bit more here about our selection cuts. So you can kind of see here in the picture, there's seedlings established or released in small gaps, resulting from removal of single or small group trees. This works and mimics kind of our natural forest succession here in Maine. We don't usually have large scale disturbances like they do out west due to wildfires. Our disturbances are usually much smaller. We have natural mortality from our large overmature trees, loss from competition, ice storms, lightning strikes, things like that. So these cuts are repeated at 10 to 20 year intervals with the whole canopy never being removed at once. So you're having multiple age classes, multiple entries, and it's creating these frequent repeated disturbances. And so this will give you multiple age classes. You can, and I think we've mentioned this before, you can opt to do different cuts on different parts of your property. So you can include uneven aged and even aged. If you're looking for more of a natural, Maine natural succession, it's usually going to be more small disturbance. Here's an example here of a selection cut. And if you want to see selection cut in person, down in Jefferson at the Hidden Valley Nature Preserve there, they've done some selective cutting, just taking out small groups and individual large overmature trees. And it's a great example. So if you ever have time to make it down there, I'd highly recommend it. But you can see we've let some light into our forest floor to allow for some regeneration. The photo on the left looks to be a complete closed canopy, so we're not really getting any kind of new growth. Now in the right-hand side, we're starting to see some multiple levels in our forest. So patch selection. This is cuts that are smaller than our clear cuts. They're only about 1/2 acre to 4 acres in size. It mimics, smaller scale disturbances as well. We often use this to create wildlife habitat. So grouse and woodcock. I know at Fry Mountain, wildlife management. They've done a couple of these cuts to encourage grouse habitat. Okay, intermediate treatments. So we discussed in the beginning that our regeneration treatments, those are really focused on creating the next cohort or next age class. These intermediate treatments are focusing on our current mature trees. We're going to take a look at weeding, thinning, and crop tree release. There's also pruning. I decided to omit that one. I get questions about pruning pretty frequently, but it seems to be that the mills around here don't really pay any extra for pruning. So pruning, when done correctly, can help remove some of the knots in the wood, making more desirable lumber. But it can also, it's time consuming, it can be expensive. And if they aren't paying more, it's usually not worth doing. So weeding is removing our undesirable trees that are competing with our preferred tree species. So this is where it's really important to have your management plan and your objectives clearly defined so you know exactly which trees you're going to be encouraging. So this is removing the undesirable trees from around our desirable trees. So you're going to do this once our desirable species are established and they can already outcompete our sprouts. This is a good one for beech management. You're going to want to weed hardwoods in midsummer to decrease sprouting. If you go out and try and thin beech in the wintertime when it's already stored as nutrients, it's just going to explode with growth in the spring. So make sure that you're hitting hardwoods in midsummer when they're in their peak growing season. And then thinning is usually done between 10 to 30 years, and you're concentrating on the growth of your most desirable trees. So these two usually go hand in hand. A lot of times people do both practices on their forest. Crop tree release. This one I get a lot of questions about too. Crop trees, and when we're talking about silviculture, don't really refer to a tree that's producing a crop. So we're not looking at apple trees. It's more on the lines of our product tree. So it's our tree that we're looking at for lumber. I've also heard it being used, in Nrcs does this pretty frequently, for acorns. So that way it is producing a mast, but we're looking at it as a full product. So we're encouraging that product tree, encouraging the oak tree, encouraging our pine tree. So with our crop tree release, we're going to identify the tree in our stand, usually around the 10-15 year mark. And, you know, we're going to try and cut our undesirable trees from around those crop trees. So very similar to thinning, weeding. But when it comes to crop trees, you're really going to focus on your tallest, dominant, co-dominant trees. They shouldn't have any sort of outward sign of defect or decay. Multiple tops usually aren't desirable either, especially with our pine trees. They need to be able to get at least a 16-foot log out of it. Okay, so now that we've looked at a couple different silviculture treatments and some of our intermediate treatments here, just some things that you can think about when applying basic silviculture techniques to your own forest. Number one, define your property goals. It's hard to pick out a silviculture method or your preferred species unless you know your goals. We have some great resources that I can email out to you guys that can help you better define your goals. Also working with a consulting forester, they can help you kind of pick out goals and objectives. Also really knowing your property, spending some time walking around, identifying the species, taking a look at your soils, knowing the aspect, elevation, boundaries. If you guys are interested in learning the soils on your property, with a plan, they usually include soils, but I also can send you instructions on using Web Soil Survey. I've used it myself when planting trees in my gardens. And then also reviewing the which tree do I cut document. That includes a lot of great information that you can reference. And we're going to have this slideshow recorded. So if you get a plan written up by a consulting forester and you want to kind of refer to this on some of the terminology and things, we'll have this resource available. And then reaching out to your local district forester. We're always happy to help you guys get in touch with other people in your areas that can help you meet your goals. All right, I know that was a lot of material. I guess, do you guys have any questions?
Kat asks, how would you advise transitioning part of a managed forest site into a pasture?
Great question. So first thing, when you're filling out your forest operation notification, you're going to click the change of use button there. That tells Maine Forest Service that you are going to be changing from a forest to a pasture land. I think your best bet, if you are planning on transitioning from forest to pasture, would be reaching out to NRCS first. A lot of times with pasture, you have to make sure that your soils are going to be conducive to having livestock. There are some soil types that you just aren't going to be able to, I guess, sustainably keep livestock on. I would reach out to those guys first. Also, meeting with your district forester, we can take a look at what species are out there and I guess what the likelihood of regeneration is going to be there. If you have a lot of beech, that one can be kind of hard to tackle, but there are different options, mechanical or herbicide, that you can look into too. Had a question, where can we find which tree do I cut online? The whole book is actually online. I got some of the pictures off of there. We can send that out to you guys in an email, a link to that book. And if you meet with your district forester, we can actually give you a hard copy too.
I just posted the link to the Landowner 101 class, where the resources are all online. So those books that Alyssa's been talking about are all, links to them will all be there. And that's where you'll find the recordings, and also these PowerPoint presentations are there. So you can kind of listen to the recording and watch the presentation at your leisure again. Jordan asks, is Maine Forest Service promoting silvicultural systems to promote carbon sequestration for carbon credits and climate change resiliency?
So when I meet with landowners, I don't necessarily recommend one system or another during that site visit. That's usually something that the consulting forester will do. But on every visit, we encourage sustainable forest management, including keeping some carbon on the ground too. I know Malcolm had mentioned during his presentation that fuel loads can be a concern, but also that buildup of organic matter is very important in keeping some of that carbon on our forest. As far as climate change resiliency goes, if you are interested in climate adapted species, we have a presenter. Is she next week, Terry, or the week after? Alita?
Alita is next week.
Okay. Alita McKee is going to be presenting on climate adapted species, and she has some planting suggestions. As far as silviculture treatments go, you can opt to favor climate adapted species in your forest plans. There are some species that are predicted to do better than others in our Maine forests. So if you are interested in climate change, climate resiliency, definitely stick around for her presentation next week.
One of the issues as far as carbon credits go, there are a lot of larger landowners in the state of Maine that are being paid for their carbon credits. One of the things that has been very difficult traditionally is for a smaller landowner to take advantage of that. They just don't have the clout in the marketplace that the bigger landowners have. Maine Woodland Owners is actually in conversations with a couple of different carbon credit groups right now, trying to figure out whether or not their approximately 13,000 acres would be worth doing the carbon credits on, but also whether or not that would translate towards small landowners. They're trying to figure out whether individual landowners might have to band together to make a big enough group to do it. Of course, one of the problems is that it locks up the property for a really long time with the carbon credits. And a lot of landowners, small landowners, are not interested in locking up their property for that long because they're planning to pass it on to their family, et cetera, and they don't want to put that kind of burden on whoever inherits the property. So Maine Forest Service is working with carbon sequestration, and we do encourage people to do it. But as far as carbon credits themselves, we're really not in that market, and we don't really have any way to be in that market. Do we envision plantation forestry making a comeback anytime soon in Maine, Alyssa?
So on one of the slides, it had mentioned that silviculture is a practice we can use to have predictable harvests. We can use silviculture to predict harvests, but not our markets. It's really hard to encourage people to plant plantation style forests when there isn't a market available now for those products. Normally when you have plantation style forests, there's mills already in place for those, or it's done kind of in conjunction with. The two go hand in hand. And you know, with how quickly our forests regenerate here, artificial regeneration isn't really a thing. It's expensive. If you look at costs for arborgen seed, it's very, very expensive. A lot of work goes into those. So I don't envision plantation style forestry coming back to Maine anytime soon, especially with our current science. It's always adapting and changing, and we're encouraging multi-level, multi-species forests now. So plantations are just kind of on the way out. Yes, exactly. Kat points out we want to avoid the monoculture of plantation forestry. You know, I think there's a place for them. The Southeast seems to be doing pretty well. There's a lot of wildlife that seems to do pretty well with those plantations. But here in Maine, we don't have the wildlife. We don't have the markets. And we're really, with the science, pushing for multi-level, multi-species forests.
We also don't have the growing season and the growing speed that the South has.
Right.
A lot of those really fast growing trees aren't going to grow well up here in Maine, and certainly not at the rate that they are in Georgia.
Yeah, loblolly pine is sometimes on a 20-year rotation, which that means planting and then clear cutting in a 20-year rotation. And you know, it also, with those plantations that they have in the Southeast, it's not talked about a lot, but they're all planted in rows, and there's a lot of herbicide, pesticides, so that increases your costs. Some people use goats, but there's also costs to housing those guys too. So there's a lot of money and time that has to go into plantations, whereas we're pretty fortunate that we have pretty good regeneration here where we don't have to focus on that artificial regeneration.
I just thought I'd throw in a cautionary note here. If you are hiring a logger and you're not using a forester and you don't have a forest management plan, the chances are that you are not really doing silviculture on your property. What you're having is a harvest. And there may or may not be any kind of silvicultural system. Usually, if you're working with a logger, and this is not to say just that loggers can't do a good job, because they can, but they're thinking more in the very short term usually than in the long term. And any silvicultural system should be thinking 20, 30, 40 years down the road. What are we regenerating? What are we trying to grow here? How are we going to have this be sustainable? Whereas if you're simply dealing with a logger, you're a lot more likely to get kind of a cut the best, leave the rest type of mentality.
Right. We call that high grading. And that's not a sound silviculture practice for sure.
Yeah.
Cat. Oh,
yeah.
Silvipasture. So I really enjoy Silvipasture. I helped out with a lot of those in South Dakota. So one of the difficulties here with silvopasture, if you do a little research here, is with the white pine weevil. So to get the type or the kind of grass production that's required to sustain most of our livestock, you have to have more sunlight, and it makes it very difficult with our pine trees and the pine weevil to have them not get killed and create a quality pine product while allowing enough light through for that grass. Another thing here, at least in the mid-coast portion of Maine, right now markets are kind of tending towards white pine and oak. Cows will get fat off oak, that's fine, but you also have to take into consideration pine needle abortion with cows, so keeping them out of your pine stands during certain times of the year. And you also have to make sure that you have enough pens for rotational grazing, because you want to, and with this type of rotational grazing, it's not just keeping them out for the season or for a couple weeks and swapping to another pen. It's actually keeping them out for years, because you need to have that regeneration so you have a replacement cohort if you're actually wanting to do silviculture practices. So there's a lot that really goes into silvopasture here, and it's very interesting. I have a couple, I think they're in Sydney, that reached out about it, and they're going to be working with a consulting forester that also has cattle. So I'm curious to see what he comes up with for a plan. So there might be one in Sydney. We'll see.
Near Athens too, a couple who work for NRCS, and they're doing some silvopasture.
Yeah, I think they have a couple programs for silvopasture, unless they've changed it up.
Yeah, and if you're looking for NRCS funding, it does tend to vary from county to county. The money goes where the most need is. So down east, really, there's very little available for any kind of forestry culture. Almost all of the money goes to blueberries. So it's very dependent on the agricultural needs of an individual county.
So we had a question from Jordan, and Terry, you might be better able to answer this question. I don't really have very many industrial companies operating in my district.
Okay. He wants to know, are the large industrial companies operating in Maine, Weyerhaeuser, AFM, SAPI, doing sustainable ecological silviculture in their forestry? They are doing that. I think it's a little bit more difficult sometimes on a large scale. When a small landowner is doing harvesting, they usually have very specific wants and desires, whereas larger companies are informed a lot more by their stakeholders and their shareholders. And so there's a little bit more pressure to get the bottom dollar. So there is a lot of clear cutting going on some of these larger companies. Or with Maine's FPA laws, anything in those larger clear cuts, they actually have to have a 1-to-1 set aside that is not clear cut. So they are setting aside a lot of land around what they're cutting to take that ecological place. There are also a number of companies in Maine that are doing outcome-based forestry, which is another whole animal in itself. But there are some very specific criteria which those companies are required to meet. So I would say I think sometimes maybe some of their better growing land is more what we would call in typical industrial forestry, whereas some of the lesser growing land, which happens to usually be a lot of the water bodies and corridors, which are really good for wildlife to travel. So you get a lot of ecological diversity in those areas.
Looks like we have a question here from Jan. If there's an area of wetland on the property near the lake, is there any special care or treatment recommended, or leave it be? I've left it alone for years and no lumbering was ever done on it. So our wetlands, depending on the size and significance, and with our waterways, lakes, rivers, how much what drainage, there can be through statewide standards buffers on those, where you can do 40% removal or 60 basal area per square feet retained. So it would depend on your wetland. That's something that we could take a look at on your property. Or if you're curious, we have maps online. You can pull up your statewide standard map for your town and then check if your water resource is listed on there. The pink on the maps will be a 250-foot buffer from the high water line, and the dark blue will be 75 feet from our high water line. So it is possible to do some activities in those areas. It's just going to be limited.
And I think some of it depends on the species that you have there, whether you have some very old growth, whether it's starting to fall apart. You know, the natural progression of a tree is to grow up and then to die. So you may want to try to capture the value of the trees that are there, and with careful silvicultural decisions, you can get a good quality mix of trees back rather than having some of the, I call it garbage, that might typically grow in those places. You know, I mean, balsam fir will certainly grow up there everywhere, but that may not be the best thing to grow there. So you may try to tip the species a little bit more towards something else. And Kenny makes the point that green certification standards call for sustainable practices, and many of the larger landowners follow these standards are audited by third-party entities. The two big ones here in the state of Maine are SFI, which is the Sustainable Forest Initiative, and FSC, which is the Forest Stewardship Council, I believe. There are some fairly strict requirements on things that have to be done in order for them to maintain those certifications.
You guys have some good questions.
Yeah, very good questions. Does anybody else have any questions or comments? Well, I guess not. Thanks an awful lot, Alyssa. That was a great presentation, and some really good questions that came out of it. Next week, we will have Planting for Climate Change, I think is the name of Alita's presentation. So that's going to be discussing some of the trees that and bushes that should be able to adapt as the climate does change. And then Dave Fuller will be talking about non-timber forest products. He works for the Cooperative Extension, and he does a really good presentation on things that you can do with your land just besides cutting trees. There are a lot of crafty things, or selling fir tips, things like that. He's got some really good ideas on that.